Welcome to this series of talks dealing with 8 sessions on the social teachings of the Church and political science. The economy does not live in a vacuum. The economy lives within a political system, a political ideology. And these series of 8 talks will actually try and help us understand how the social doctrine of the Church tries to give light onto this reality of an economy which needs to take political considerations in the light of values which the social teachings of the Church advocate. Allow me to start by a short introduction of who I am. Some of you may not know, but I am actually today an independent consultant, financial consultant. I am also a co-founder of the Catholic Voices in Malta, which is a group that engages in dialogue on media and also the social media. But my previous experience was that of a politician. I was a mayor of a locality in Birkirkara in Malta, and I was also Minister of Finance for 9 years. And therefore, I will try and actually deal with the issues that we will be discussing in these 8 sessions, also as practical as possible, rather than merely the theoretical or the academic aspects of the subject, but also how we can apply that to the realities of politics and economics. Interesting, the word economics comes from the Greek word iokos, which means household, and nomos, which means rule. So economics is about the rules of a household. On the other hand, the word politics comes from the Greek politikos, which is relating to the citizen. And so when we talk about the political economy, we are talking actually the rules of an economy in the benefit of its citizens. And I think this really also depicts the whole objective of the social teachings of the Church, of making the human being the center of focus of any economic and political decision. The human being in his dignity, which is one of the fundamental principles of the social teachings of the Church. And therefore, it is from economics of a family to the economics of a nation, which in reality and practice, as a person who's lived also in the role of a Minister of Finance, I can tell you that if you apply good governance in your family in terms of how you budget for your family, it is not very different from what you need to think about when you think about a nation. So let's now focus a bit on the economy. What is the economy? And I am aware that possibly for those who are following this course, they may not be versed by a lot of economic principles. And therefore, I will try to be as basic as possible. I apologize for those who possibly know more about the economy, but I am assuming that I am talking to people who are starting on the subject, who may have some consciousness about it, but not really a deep academic knowledge. And therefore, I try to be as simple as possible. So what is an economy? An economy is really a mechanism. It is an ecosystem. It is a system whereby we have the production of goods, their distribution, and eventually their consumption. And therefore we have a market which is created for those goods that are provided and for consumers that want to consume it. Broadly, there are 3 types, to be simplistic, 3 types of economic system. There is, on the one side, the free market economy. Some people say it's on the right, which is the liberal, the capitalist notion of what is an economy. Then on the left, on the further left, we have the command economy, the controlled economy, the economy which many times is associated with socialism, and that we find on the left. In the middle, we say there is a third model, which is the mixed economy, which in reality can be a variant of hundreds of different models of an economy, which apply basically some principles from the right and from the left of the concepts of the economy. So an economy and the structure of an economy is very much dependent and underpinned by the political philosophy of that economy. Let us now go a bit historically and think of how the economy evolved. And we realize that it is not very much different from these systems, although there has been an evolution. The very first real economic system the world knows about or that has really developed into a national economic system, is what was feudalism. Feudalism is a system which we still see many times in the world around us, which had the concept of a king, the noble people who were the landlords, who owned the land in the country and gave allegiance to the king who gave them protection. They had the knights who gave protection to the nation, and the peasants who worked within the land to produce crop for the families, for the lords, for the king, which created an ecosystem of production and protection. Because in reality, in the harsh times of the Middle Ages, and also before that, there was the reality of also having invaders. And therefore, a country needed to protect its borders from invaders who used to come and take the produce, the products that they have not produced. And this is a system which in reality we see in many parts of the world still even today. Possibly in the more primitive parts where you find, even in Africa, you still find tribes. Even in Asia, you still find this reality of having a community which is led by the tribal leader who everyone owes allegiance to. He provides protection through the taxes he collects, pays for the soldiers, and they give that necessary protection. That was the feudal system. The feudal system, which eventually was called the agrarian or manor economy, where therefore you had the lords and the kings, and then you had the lower people, which were the peasants. In reality, the peasants lived in a sort of command economy. They were not really given much freedom. They had their piece of land from which they produce. They benefited from the product, but then they had to pay their taxes to the lords for their protection. So it was a piece of land, some money, and protection, what peasants lived for. This all changed with the Industrial Revolution that happened in the late 18th century, early 19th century, where the reality of factories came about, primarily from cotton, and huge factories were being built, where people were moving away from the agricultural land, from the rural areas into the urban areas, into the new cities that were being created. But this shifted the whole notion of the economy. Why? Because from a situation where you had the peasant who owned land, produced, and from what he produced, he paid a tax to whoever gave him protection, to a reality where the peasant became a worker who had no right to claim for land, who went to work on a land which was owned by the factory owner for a pay that he many times had no control for, competing with other workers to try and get a salary for his family. So this changed the whole, radically, the whole notion of how an economy really worked. And in reality, this, I'm on slide 11 now, converted the situation from a peasant having a piece of land and home. With hard work he earned food, protection, and he had some money, to a situation as shown on slide 12 where the worker lost ownership, lost control of his job, found a job in a factory. In reality, in the Industrial Revolution, in the beginning of it, there was no thought of worker conditions, so they worked in very poor work conditions, excessive hours, low pay, lacked creativity. You just did the job you were defined to do. And so, in reality, for the low pay, they could afford low living conditions, because many times in the cities, the house they lived in was not owned by them, as the peasant owned the farm, but they had to rent the property with no security. They didn't know if they will get the job tomorrow, and no social welfare in a situation where they lose the job. So this transformed radically the concept of the economy in that time. And a new theory evolved, which is still with us today, a new economic theory which was called the capitalist economic theory. It was founded in 1776 in the writings of the famous Adam Smith when he wrote the book The Wealth of Nations, And Adam Smith believed that the economy worked through an invisible hand. And this invisible hand was actually moving everyone to maximize his abilities, to maximize the return for the work he do. And as everyone worked to maximize individually his earnings, then the wealth of a nation grows. Now, what this obviously forgot was that not everyone had the ability to maximize his worth. Not everyone had the ability to compete at the same level. And therefore, it emerged that under this system, you had the rich who were becoming always richer, those that are able to work having a level of living, we will not discuss at this stage the standard of living, and those who would not actually compete at that level to be effectively unemployed, outcast, and be deemed extra to society. And under the capitalist notion, there was no notion of supporting those because they were not maximizing the wealth of the nation. This theory is still with us today. Today, we call it the liberal theory of economics. It is based on the foundation of a concept called laissez-faire. Laissez-faire means you do not approach economics in a way that you try and control it, but you let things happen alone. Laissez-faire. Now, the problem with that sort of theory, as I said, is that only the richer become richer, and the rest, the people, are considered to be a means of production or consumers. So they're either people that produce goods that I sell, or else they are the people that consume the goods, that many times are in an economy the same people, because workers actually are the biggest consumers in a society. But the poor, in that sort of model, have no place, unfortunately, because there are no systems that actually take into account the reality of the poor. This created social difficulties, because obviously workers started to feel that they were being abused of, that they were being taken unfairly, that they were not getting the real benefits for their work. And under this system, a class struggle started to emerge. The workers against the owners of the factories, the land, whoever had wealth. And new theories started to emerge, mainly inspired from the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution in reality came well before the Industrial Revolution, because the French Revolution was effectively 100 years before, in 1789. But this already gave a number of what are called socialist ideas, which meant the overturning of power, the taking of the power from the hands of the rich and giving it to the workers. That was the basic concept, that therefore the workers owned themselves collectively the resources for the benefit of the whole community as a whole. Now, it sounds quite a positive theory when you have it, but we will also see the difficulties with that theory. And this theory was developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1848, when they actually developed the first Communist Manifesto, which eventually became an economic system for quite a number of large countries, some still present with us today. We had the former Soviet Union, with the Eastern European countries in Europe after the Second World War, which were under communist regimes. We still have China that adopts this model, Cuba, and also North Korea and some other countries. So we can still see that there are still countries that adhere to this concept of an economy. Now, this concept looks at a number of steps that need to be taken. First of all, it strives, it grows precisely on the conflict that emerges between a working class that is feeling unfairly treated and a capitalist class that is not conscious of the issues and the problems that it is creating to the working class. And therefore, the working class are inspired under this model to revolt against the capitalist class to take over the resources. And therefore, the ownership of resources becomes a social ownership owned by the state, the creation of a system that basically centralizes everything, so it is the state that decides what everybody should be doing for the benefit of the community, the abolition of what are called classes in society, and the development of a social democracy and the cultural revolution that in effect saw within that also the abolishment of God and religion within that theory, because these were perceived to be part of the old realities that supported precisely the old capitalist or the emerging capitalist system. However, we know that socialism has and has had its own failings, primarily because the creation of a totalitarian regime that tries to dictate to everyone what he does did not effectively provide real equality. So, although the ideal was to have an equal society, in reality, in socialist totalitarian regimes, there is no such thing as an equal society. We may call ourselves brothers, but the people who are on the higher levels of power of the totalitarian regime were actually the new capitalists, who merely used the workers as their own means of production. So it was not really a collective governance or a collective economic structure, but it was simply the shift of power from the hands of who owned the resources to the new owners of resources, which were the people on the top of the state apparatus that actually controlled those resources. And the only equality that it created in many countries was an equality of poverty, of still low working conditions, and not the aspirations that the revolutions of the communist regimes really sought to inspire. And therefore we saw counter-revolutions. We all remember the revolution in Poland led by Lech Walesa, who actually revolted against the communist regime inspired by democracy as a means of governance of a nation. Unfortunately, the socialist system ignores the incentive of human dignity, the incentive that is created by wanting to do something for yourself, because there is nothing which is yours. Everything is of the state. And so as everything is of the state, you have no incentive to work harder, because at the end of the day, you will not benefit from working harder, because the state will take the benefit. And this was the fundamental difficulty with communist systems. And within this cloud, therefore, of countries adopting a very radical capitalist liberal system that was not taking any respect of the working conditions of the worker and assuming a very liberal approach of ignoring poverty, then you had the extreme communists who were talking about a conflict, the abolition of private property, and of the state apparatus of, therefore, managing all countries' resources, capital, property, and human beings. Within this conflict, the Church came out with its first teaching on what is called the social teachings of the Church. And this was the important encyclical, which is still a very important encyclical till today world, even though it's practically over 100 years old, in 1891 by Pope Leo XIII, called Rerum Novarum, which meant of new things. This encyclical actually expressed outrage very strongly against the disparity that existed between the rich and the working class. Something which was not even so evident in the older systems. The new system actually increased the inequality of between what the rich earned and what the poor were actually getting. On the other hand, it did not agree with the concept that the solution, as the socialists were advocating, was the abolition of private property and the state taking over all the ownership with the excuse to actually benefit the common good. This obviously contrasted significantly with the Marxist ideology and belief that built their theory on the struggle of the working class against the rich. And therefore the church came strongly against the notion of class struggle as a means of solving this issue. On the other hand, the church in this document upheld an important principle, the principle that labor has priority over capital, that the human being is more important and is more than merely a means of production that we put with capital to have goods and services. The human being comes above. He has dignity. He should be respected. And therefore, if he works, the work he does should help him flourish as a person and give him a fair compensation for the effort he is giving to that enterprise. And therefore, there was the first notions of the concept of a just wage. It was actually the Catholic Church that came up with the first notion that workers deserved a just wage. It also emphasized, this first document, the role of the state. The role of the state that should not dominate, as was happening under the systems that were the feudal systems, but also the systems advocated by socialism, where the state takes over and dominates everything in society. Rather, the role of the state is that of encouraging public well-being and private prosperity. Later on, this concept is developed in the more known concept in the social teachings of the Church of the common good, and therefore that the state is there for the common good, not for the good of the few, not for the good of growing the economy, for growing the economy itself. Today in the political sphere we hear a lot about this concept. The economy is growing. Fine, it is good that the economy is growing. But the economy doesn't grow just for itself. The economy has to grow for the common good. And therefore everyone participating directly or indirectly in that economic sphere should be benefiting from the growth in that economy. And that is the concept of the common good. And therefore this document, Rerum Novarum, sought to answer 5 social questions. The first being defining the relationship between the employer and the employee to ensure fairness, that there is a just distribution of wealth, so the wealth that is created is not of the few, but should be benefited by all. To fight the growing isolation of workers, and therefore the Church here advocated that workers cannot be left alone, but promoted the idea of workers' associations, which eventually evolved into unions. So the Church saw it a good thing that workers joined together, not to fight a violent battle as the Marxists were and the Socialists were advocating to overturn the rich, but rather to collectively work to get better rights for workers. And this we know is a fundamental role of unions in our society. But also the Church saw a significant decline in moral values. In both spheres, both in the capitalist system and in the Marxist socialist ideology, God was out. Morality was out. And this was the key concern of the Church, because once you eliminate morality from the economy, then, as Pope Francis says, the economy kills. And this is what the Church from the beginning in Rerum Novarum was actually expressing as a concern. So the encyclical addressed 5 key issues. The concept of private property, rights and obligations related. So the Church is not against an individual having private property or a company owning property, but there are obligations that emerge from it, and that property at the end is for the common good. The right of the Church to speak on social issues. This was like the first time the Church came out so clearly on social issues. Still today, There are people who say the church should not be speaking about social issues. It should just be speaking about the moral issues, the issues that affect the spirituality of the individual. Wrong. The church, over 120 years ago, affirmed its position that it has an obligation to talk about social issues. And effectively, through this encyclical, to Rerum Novarum, it was the only institution, global institution, that was challenging the economic orders that were evolving and defending even the rights of workers in doing so. It sought also to define better the role of the state, not of dominating, but of actually facilitating the growth of society and of the individual, the well-being of the individual in that society. It talked about the just wage that workers deserved, and as I said, also the importance of workers' association. The church effectively has concerns both with capitalism and socialism. So Rerum Novarum was not just about no to socialism, but it was also about no to capitalism. And the church was actually advocating a different approach to the economy. And what were the main concerns of the church on capitalism? And these come from Rerum Novarum, clause 3. You will find it in slide 23. And the concerns were that it was seeing in society that workers were unprotected, that political institutions were ignoring religious teaching, so becoming amoral, that industry and the power of industrialists were controlling factory workers to the point that the working class was being abused, and therefore the working class was becoming poorer rather than having good working condition, and that there was a conflict, a real conflict that emerged also later in many countries between the working class and those that owned land and property, which brought about an escalation and even revolution. Now, in reality, capitalism remained a concern for the church. Even John Paul II, when he spoke in Centesimus Annus, which was the document 100 years exactly after Rerum Novarum, also expressed concerns on capitalism and said, "We have seen that it is unacceptable to say that the defeat of so-called real socialism leaves capitalism as the only model of economic organization." Some people used to think that because the church came out so strongly against socialism, then it was advocating capitalism as a solution. This is not so. He says, "It is necessary to break down the barriers and monopolies which leave so many countries on the margins of development, and to provide all individuals and nations with the basic conditions that will enable them to share in that development." And unfortunately, the global economic system is a liberal capitalist economic system, which still today is leaving a lot of individuals, millions of people, living in poverty, and therefore clearly it was not a solution. So there's a distinction, according to John Paul II in Centesimus Annus, between business economy and capitalism. Any economy requires business. Business in itself is not wrong, because business is what every individual is allowed to express as also his right in developing a business which produces goods or service for others, of making him even creative. So for the church, the business is something which is positive. What is not positive is an economic system that ignores the realities, the social realities behind individuals who are left on the side. And it is important to note that John Paul II actually came from Poland, which for a long number of years he lived under the totalitarian communist regime. So one would expect that he was so much against communism that he will come out in favor of capitalism. In reality, he criticized consistently both systems. And you will also see a number of quotes, which I do not have time to go through them, that actually come up with this point. Even Pope Benedict XVI in Caritas in Veritatis comes out very clearly that the capitalist system is not a system that can be relied on to create justice in society. And again, I will leave you to read those quotes for yourself, due also the time constraints we have. But as I said, so the church was concerned with the capitalist model, but equally concerned with the socialist model, which was trying to create this strife between workers and owners of production to bring this overturn. The socialist thought created a lot of concerns for the church, because socialism limited the capacity of the human being to plan for his own future, because he became a means of production that the state dictates what to do. The fact that people lost possession of land to the state for the church was a concern in terms of human dignity. If we read the encyclical, we realize that the fact that an individual owns a property helps him feel dignified, that he is independent, that he has provided for his family. So the church attaches a lot of importance to that notion. And also, the fact that the state takes over the role of workers in deciding what to do is actually very demotivating, and therefore that does not help the flourishing of the individual in a society. And this is found in Rerum Novarum Clause 4, where these concepts are so clearly outlined. But is any form of socialism wrong? In reality, as time evolved, the church started to recognize that socialism was being effectively transformed. And Pope Pius XI in 1931, 40 years after Rerum Novarum, made this important statement that not all socialism effectively is wrong, because socialism was in effect being divided in two camps. The extreme socialists, which effectively became the communists, and communism remained something that for the church was of serious concern, because it remained tied to the past concepts of the class warfare, of the absolute extermination of private property, and that communism effectively declared itself to be atheist, and therefore did not accept in any way morality in its system, or the church, or a role of a church in society. So for that, the church remained very clearly against communism. However, it also recognized a movement of socialism towards Christian values. So it started emerging that there were wings of socialism that were also embracing Christian values. And this was acknowledged also in this document, saying that this type of socialism is a moderate socialism, that in effect, in certain ways, it was approaching to the Christian tradition of how it saw society. And this is important because obviously the church is not concerned in dictating what type of political governance a country has, but of whether that political governance is effectively living within the values advocated by the Catholic Church. But the real concern of the church in socialism was its materialistic understanding of life. So God was outside of life. We only live for our material value. And so we solely exist to produce wealth that can be shared amongst others. Now we know that we are not created just to be means of productions. We are human beings created in God's image and likeness, and we shall see in the social teachings of the church, and there is more to life than just work. But this socialism ignored. May I say that most political and economic systems tend to ignore, because when we talk about the economy, we ignore the morality and the spirituality of the human being. And so we find we can apply that even to capitalist theories. So this was the main concern of the church. And I close therefore with this thought, that the social doctrine of the church is not there to defend a political or economic system. As we saw, the church actually was against both extremes: communism, the control economy, and the liberal economy, capitalism. The church came out clearly against both systems. The economic system that the church advocates is one that is built on the principles of justice. And this is what the whole social teachings of the church actually is all about. And this is what we will discuss in our next 7 sessions that we will have together. Thank you for following this session.